Okay, that was a quick workaround. Sorry about the delay. Sarah, just give me a thumbs up if the sound of the thing. Okay, good to go. Okay, so round 3 here. And we'll put that 3 in the corner as we started. Actually, I think we're actually calling this 2 because the first one was 0. So sorry about that. This is number 2 in the series. The 0 is just the first introductory from a week ago. And these will pile up 2 per week. So what we're going to move in today is the sort of the diving board of the power of Gothic language for Parisian architecture. And so the step is actually outside of Paris today. It's not in the heart of Paris, but it comes from the Bishop of Paris in the 3rd century. And his name was Denis, or Denis, D-E-N-I-S. And so the fate of his story is what really creates this great proclamation of a structural design, which ends up being metaphysical in terms of the promise of light inside an ecclesiastical piece of architecture. So we're going to start with the plan type up in the upper left, but first, more importantly, is the story that generates this, which is really a spectacle in Christian faith. So Saint Denis was the bishop of the Christian faith in the city of Paris at the time, which had been under Roman rule. They had taken it from the local tribe, the Parisi. They had renamed it Lutetia. So when you visit Paris, you'll see some cafes Lutetia, some Hotel Lutetia for the old Roman name. And within that sort of conflagration of peoples there, the Romans as a settlement, the original Parisi descendants, other people that came, there were not only Christian people preaching, but also other pagan type of religions that were commingled in there. And Saint Denis and his brethren had such success, they made the pagan priests very nervous. So they talked the Roman militia, government at the time, to imprison Saint Denis. And eventually that whipped up such a furor of anti-sentiment that they also felt it was deemed worthy to martyr him or to decapitate him at some point after his imprisonment. And to sort of honor that story, there were actually statuary across Christendom. This is the actual one from Notre Dame in the front that shows a priest within the Christian faith with his head in his hands. Now, this is a spectacle because how can the hands be holding this? And that's this incredible story about Saint Denis, who at the mountain, and there's not really mountains, but the larger vertical part of land, there's one south of the river called Saint-Geneviève, and we saw the Pantheon built on that. The one north you might have heard of more often is called Montmartre, which is Mountain of the Martyr, based off of the martyrdom of Saint Denis as the Bishop of Paris. So he's lost the Christian faithful. And yet, as the story goes, the one that proclamates the future of Saint Denis and the 2,000-year-old story, or almost 2,000-year-old story of Saint Denis, is upon decapitation, he picked up his head and walked 9 kilometers with his head in hand while he was lecturing, preaching to the faithful. And then finally passed 9 kilometers away in a small area that now is known as Saint Denis. So on that site, his actual passing becomes a sacred story, a sacred sort of relic of the faithful that would come to this site to see the spot, which was sort of a sanctuary immediately upon that story. And from there sprouted smaller architecture, larger architecture, until eventually in the latter part of early Christian, there was actually buildings on the site. And so we see it today in the model here of Saint Denis is more architecture built on that site. And so we're here architecturally because there's 3 periods are in this building. And a lot of times we think that architecture typically is you start in one corner and then finish, keep moving across in a short amount of time. But cathedrals take hundreds of years, many, many different campaigns under many series of guilds and the language being passed down. So the stages of Saint Denis are kind of unique in that they started the frontispiece, which is much like Chartres or early Notre Dame, very Romanesque, very mural, again with the tri-portal, the 3 entries, the nave in the front, the side aisles on either side, and then bell towers that would rise up with spires on the top. What's left you see in this model now is Saint Denis because they got destroyed in the Revolution, and then the plans that Viollet-le-Duc restored Notre Dame didn't get activated here at Saint Denis. So when you visit now, it has a singular tower to it. So that's all still early to late Romanesque construction, very mural, very sort of fortified, very a public type of, again, facing west and the east-west orientation. And then in the body of the church, we actually see something much more developed in terms of Gothic language, because as the old church came down and they rebuilt new on the existing foundations, the first part we're interested in is over here on the eastern end, the apse. And the apse has this spectacle of changing architectural structure in a revolutionary way. And so before we step into the details of Saint Denis proper, let's just talk about the language of an arch. So over here in the left corner, we're simply going to go back to that kind of Roman model of saying that if you have two columns rising up, and now you take a circle inside that, and have a column support, that structure of the arch that comes down on top of that is much stronger than the beam would have been in earlier architecture. So when the Romans really kind of completed this solution, it was an epic change in terms of the scale and performance of space, because you could split the space between columns and create bigger volumes on the interior of architectural environments. And so that was really a lovely pronouncement of their sort of global reach with the Roman arch and the presence of that. And we'll still see ideas of that entrapped in the Gothic we're going to move into now, because that's how the early language became Gothic, as it kind of springboards into this new, almost like unlimited partie. And so what changes here now is, in this type of language, in the floor plan, it needs to be square in plan, if those are the four columns that support that. Because if you have an arch that connects those, and an arch connects those, and an arch connects those, and those, in order to create a ceiling for that, you have to vault then from one side to the other. So this could be a tunnel vault. So we could take that back like an axon and simply draw that same arch over here. And now you see that barrel vault or tunnel vault going back in space. So we can go back sort of and have a procession like that, go right through that, and that nice barrel vault then creates a three-dimensional structure of a whole series of arches, which in sort of in a sense diagrammatically are stacked next to each other. And so that kind of is, in a sense, a really growth of architecture to create, it could be the scale of an individual at that scale, kind of a room scale, or if you're really theatrical in the height of the Roman Empire, or you're doing epic interior spaces, that could be the size of a person. And so you're in an enormous bath hall, or enormous sort of powerful structure of the civic environment back then, on that sort of predication of what the arch can do. And so the old adage is, an arch never sleeps, because it's always working, because it's taking whatever forces come down on the top of it, and it's dispersing those evenly and soundly without pushing out on the columns down to the column itself, which then takes the load down to the ground. So it's a great sort of stasis environment predicated on the performance of a circle in section there. But you're limited because if we cross that, then all of a sudden the arches are connected then by rib vaults, which all come to the one point at the height of it. And that's what the Romanesque will do to create spaces within the columns as they rise up to a point, because all the arches share the same height. Now, the problem with this is, in plan type, if we move over here and want to do something rectilinear in plan, all of a sudden the arches will not rise to the same point, because this arch only goes to this height from side to side, whereas the side arch has to go much taller to encapsulate this distance. So that dimension is not the same as that dimension. So you can't work with rectangles in a floor plan until they invent the Gothic arch. So the Gothic arch is predicated on the notion that, let's say we have part of the floor plan is only that wide and part of it is that wide. And now our columns want to go up a certain height. We'll call them maybe a square and a half here. and they're going to spring. So the spring point is where the arch starts. So the idea is to carry down the load and have it unevenly on the spring point so it carries down vertically onto the base. So before we put a circular arch on here, and that's going to rise to a certain point, now this is going to rise much higher, so they don't meet on an even plane. The value of the innovation here at Saint Denis, and now the British historians will argue that Durham Cathedral in England actually did this earlier than Saint Denis. The French historians will say, however, that in Durham, it's decorative. It doesn't change the floor plane. It's just an image of a change in arch, whereas the French invented a way to change the attitude of the floor plan and allow more sort of variations on a theme. So the way to do that then is now you pick the point you want the arches to end at, and now you break the arch. Rather than have it continuous the whole way, like these are, in a pure form of a circle, now you're going to take two arcs of different circles and have them bow down. And it simply is what we call now the pointed arch, because it's got this directional point to it. And so in plan type now, we've created the ability to do that in plan and have the vault still meet at one point, just like it does here. And that's kind of a really simple, crude diagrammatic idea of the potential now in floor plan that it liberates the ability to move differently in plan type. And that allows us to change things in plan, as well as we'll see as this dries up in verticality to allow taller soaring spaces with less structural problems along the way. So again, this could be a singular space with a person walking through it in an abbey library or small residential scheme, or it could be a towering nave of a great Gothic cathedral where the people are dwarfed by the scale of it. So it also happens very readily, as we see in the apse now, because we're rotating around a circle, is that the edges of these are actually flaring out to be trapezoidal. So it's not just two parallel things, but it starts and each piece gets wider. And so to put those next to each other, then you can start to move people around a rectilinear space in the arc of a circle through strong rectilinear structural logic. And that can't happen until the architects of Saint Denis show how to do that structurally. So what we'll do now is we'll take that idea and we'll see how it's implemented in plan here, because even though Saint Denis is a lovely church and it goes from its earlier days to its early Gothic here to its higher reigning Gothic here in the 13th century, it took, again, hundreds of years to complete what we see now. If we take the model off here, we're going to see it's similar to the couple of plan types we've done already in the Christian faith, where obviously it has a very strong east-west axis. And the way I've kind of sketched this out now, you can see how they refer to these as radiating chapels. In a sense, that's a little bit of an icon of almost the sun and the rays of the sun coming over there, as if the spiritual course of the center of the mass that's served daily in the Christian faith is about the order of the sun and the metaphysical quality that Suger, the abbot at the time, who sort of ran the church and wanted to push the limits of this structural innovation, is that he equated the language of Christ in the actual biblical stories about it as being tied to the movement of the sun. And so the presence of the light every day was the warming of their religion as well. So it starts in the summer suns, winter suns on the eastern edge, and then it rolls over a big arc and then sets on the west side over here. And so basically you have your early morning mass, which starts the day. You go into the fields, you go to your jobs, and then come back in and you have your evening service to end the day. So this idea that your faith is predicated on the movement of the sun there too. And so that identifies the east-west axis. So again, on this side, it'll be very, very massive and mural, so we can simply build out these fortified buttressing to get those towers to rise up to have sort of a citywide presence in the contemporary village of Saint Denis now. And then inside of those little square spaces are the two towers that rise up. And so obviously you can make your way up to the tops of those spires and also see the clock towers inside that. So this is referred to as the narthex, or the between the towers and move into this, it kind of connects then the body of the village out here outside of the west to the body of the people that come to see the actual sacraments being performed, the crossing like we saw earlier. And so all along here, we'll see those same type of buttressing that we hinted at early in the elevation of Notre Dame, and we'll see in the next lecture in more detail. So we can put in those tiers of buttresses as this flares out into Gothic elegance and performs like this. It still has to have some type of external support to it, because now as you get more and more vertical, the pressure to push out and drive the forces and make the building fail becomes at an epic level. So the way to do that is to counterbalance that with the same amount of weight that's acting in terms of those flying buttresses that will come on either side of that to support that from pushing out. And that works all the way across the center nave, which comes up to that crossing of the high altar. And then typically a north and south rose window community. And then where the clergy in the eastern part of it, it used to be a little bit more privatized for only the ultimate faithful in the community, but now it's much more about moving the population around that. So that the people would come then to see the relics of, for instance, what people have brought for Saint Denis, about Saint Denis. Break out there. And when you visit all these churches, you'll see that there's a little bit shifts in the actual language of the floor plate in terms of how it's built, because it can't have, whether it's the foundation or whether it's a change in structural technology, sometimes they don't really join well together. And so there's odd relationships between 200 years of building between that joint, for instance. At Saint Denis, we'll see at Notre Dame, there's also a cant between the connection of the apse itself and the rest of the church. And sometimes that cant is pretty provocative and it shifts. So the whole body, this is not on a pure axis here like it was built all at once because it took hundreds of years. Some people think that might have been intentional, because if this is Christ on the cross, it kind of speaks sort of in a graphic way to when he expired, his head tilts to one side on the crucifix. And so they say that was intentional, not to make it perfectly lined up, that the head of Christ would actually expire to one side of it. So we have part 1, 2, and the ray and nave, which is later in Gothic 3 here. And upon visit, you'll see the amount of clarity of daylight that comes in between spaces. The least amount, the second amount, which is spectacular at the time in 1140, and then finally the third amount, which is later in Gothic, where it's really impressive in terms of how the structure kind of disappears and light takes over. So now our job is a little bit more difficult, because we're going to try to actually walk into the celebration of the nave here. So the promise we're going to do here as we walk into the space, and what's really kind of a spectacle about coming to Saint Denis beyond the story of Saint Denis itself and to see a great early Gothic church, is that the ruling kings of France decided that all French kings moving forward would then be interned in Saint Denis proper. So this is the history of all kings of France all the way up to the revolution in the 1780s, when they started to tear away at the Christian faith, the Catholic faith, and sort of defile sculptures and architecture to sort of take away the power the church had accumulated by that time in the state. So the way we're going to start this is kind of to show the space that was needed. And so what we're going to do is we're going to leave the transept and then come into, which will be in terms of floor change, we come up a little series of steps, and we really want this view that comes into the ambulatory and starts to see the movement of the apse. And then our view will be kind of across back through what ends up being like a little bit of a forest of columns that shows the structure trying to be less obvious, because the purveyance of natural light comes into the space and really illuminates this, probably to the point where it was frightening to people, because they didn't think, how could this possibly hold up without true walls? And so this is diminutive compared to the major cathedrals, but the first time in 1142 when people saw this was probably a pretty incredible spectacle. So what we'll do is we'll kind of start with a framework of what's very close to us in terms of the actual architecture here. And so we'll work with two columns that are very close to us in the image here, and we won't be able to draw the arch on top of it because we're too close to them, but it will give us a framework for how we'll kind of stop the sketch. So this one, which is sort of in the middle of the drawing over here, we'll just take the two edge lines of the rotunda of a full form column that's three-dimensional and curvilinear in space. So it's not a flat like a pilaster we'll see later in the Renaissance. It actually is round, and to get that sense of round, we'll come to the top and do a little arc. And then beneath our horizon line, which is probably about right about here at 5 foot level, we'll see the arc reverse itself. And that little bit of line work kind of makes it tubular. And then that's actually going to be the part where an arch comes down. So the arch comes up and springs off of our paper. So the one it's going to land on is actually behind this column, which is even a bit in front of this column. So this will end the sketch. So we've got a wider, fatter, truncated column closer to us, but just behind it is the twin to this one. And that's where that arch will end. And you can see, even photographically, you mentioned this earlier on a sketch in perspective at Saint-Germain, that when you look up to something very tall, not only do things vanish left and right towards the horizon line, but they all also vanish towards a vertical point up here off the page. So the camera will pick that up in perspective, that these are parallel in real life, but they tend to all move up toward a point. So it's nice to not make them all truly vertical unless they're right in the middle of the sketch. So our first chance to really create this arch will be the same two columns here further back in space. So these two go back to here and here. So we'll come to the one that's sort of partially covered by our front column. There's a little gap of space between these two. And that's the distance. We're kind of on the edge of the wall here. And there's the rotation of its rotunda, and then down here. Then its twin is just over here to the left of it. So the top of that comes to the top of that. So we've got the other support for its arch right about over here. And so there's the bottom of that, and there's the top of that. So what's going to happen is we're going to spring then, just like we did here, with an arch which is not be truly round. It's going to sort of start like it's part of an arc of a circle. And then this one will be kind of hidden by that. That'll rise up and meet right about here. And that's the broken arch up there, which completes this part of the ambulatory. So that's a walkway. And then over here's another walkway. And they'll come right to the horizon line and meet our point to show we are viewing this on the right side of that column. So we could put a person the same place we are in the distance, kind of right there, to give some scale to the space. Now push back another tier, we will see this column then, and its little round top and round base. And then it also has its arch that will spring up here, but in a clever manner now, our first two pieces in front of us, this one coming over to its point, and then the two we drew first, those are actually a square in the floor plan. It is still a flat part of the floor plan there. The next piece we see here is the start of a trapezoid in plan. So the arch is actually not coming parallel to this one, it's actually springing back in space. So instead of coming closer to this, it's actually going back to another column behind this one. So we start to see a change in manipulation in the volumes and spaces back here. So if we come now, another move along here, now we see another transept here. That column is going to come down to a point right about here. And it's the same size column as one in the front of us here, but it's thinner in the back now, so it's further away. And so its little top will start here. And so now we're going to have an arch that springs from here to another arch behind these two, which we can kind of pick up with one line. So now our view goes from being orthogonal to a rotational of moving people around kind of in this plan type. So this line comes And then after this one, it rotates, and now we're turning in perspective to the back of the apse. So we end up here. Then we have a view where that comes back beneath that horizon line, starts to turn up the other part of the church. So our view here is looking kind of across this towards this whole great form making. So whenever you see that singular image in global histories of architecture and they turn to the birth of Gothic, they're going to show you this image taken by photographers and drawn by people forever, because this is the dawn of the Gothic era in Europe at the time. So as we push back to the outer skin now, there are arches which come to the fenestration and let the light in. So at the end of a trapezoid here, we'll find this arch. And now that'll be glazing, and we'll treat that with reverence, because that's the light of the sun of the east, the morning, pervading into the space. And what they're doing, if this is Christ on the cross, they're celebrating with the glow of light in the morning, the crown of thorns. So they're powering the energy of the light as a way to create the cosmos and the atmosphere of another world with light itself inside the sanctuary of the space. And then if you see, I've got other types of arches that are coming over on the side here, which kind of finish the sketch. This one in the foreground flies out to the end of this aisle, which will be off our page. I guess we have a little bit of space up here. Once we get to the top of this capital, we can fly this arch up towards off the page here. It'll eventually come down over on this side. And then on the face of the nave itself, on the inside of the ambulatory, these also have arches just like the outside skin. So in this case, there's an arch that flies up off the page from here as well. And so it's a forest of these vaulted aspects that are now sort of kinetic in design and space, how they're holding things, the weight of all this massive masonry off the language of walls now, and doing it just with point loads. And so these great sophisticated forest of vaults, the rib vaults, where ideally all the structure really is taken by, if we come back into all these, we're going to give a thickness to them, because when they come down, they're coming on lines of stone. And those lines of stone are in plan type, the real structure. So over here in this floor plan, even in this case, that's doing most of the work. The ones that connect to the column to column or cross column and create the vault, this is really inside that. That's the fill or the vaulting sort of skin that shouldn't be taking much of the weight. It's all driven to the lines and then to the point load. Almost as if it's a sort of it's a geometrical play of a current mathematical equation, all played out with lines in space. So the tradesmen back then would sort of not be studying math, but they'd be skilled in the mathematics of construction because they understood the idea of how the structure travels through material. So as we wrap around here, I didn't do that any kind of lines for you, but as we turn, we're going to see more of the structure kind of fill out the back side. So as we wrap around, there's an arch that comes down here and drops down. One from the one next to it drops down to complete that column. A bit of a pier. And so we're wrapping around here. The floor kind of terminates right about this point. So back on this side, that will wrap towards us. We can put in, as we come this point, if that's our horizon line, the vantage point where this person's head is, we can drop these columns down a bit and show that we're tighter to this wall, but there are some vertical presence of how the space stops on the right over here. And now as we move through this space, this kind of forest of columns, and by the time we put some value on this, we'll see how we can kind of make the light activate the space. As soon as we move past this series of columns that all kind of converge on each other in our perspective, it starts to open up because we start to see the front elevation of this part of the same app. Here we're inside of it. Here we're looking at it. So in this case, when we're going across the apse here, we're going to see kind of the elevation of the interior of the church. So what's really key here, I put this one as kind of a placemaker for us because that's the arch across the apse we're looking at. And then riding next to that, I've got this one line here that drives down, because now this is our first chance to look at the throw of Gothic architecture and how vertical it can get. Because at this point, it really is a single story volume where this is simply the first floor of the church. And so it's pretty impressive that in 1142, this is, it seems like a giant space compared to the individual here. But when you get to Chartres Cathedral or Amiens or Salisbury in England, you won't even see the arches from this viewpoint because they're so far up, even on the first outside ambulatory aisle of it, let alone the nave itself. But we'll get a taste of some of that verticality now as we look at the cross elevational view, because this arch goes from this column, and on the other side, it's got kind of the same type of twin that's going to spring over to this point and then hit its sort of crowning moment of structure, and then return down to another vertical line on that elevation, which is going to run from the base all the way up. Because once we leave this column line here, we can drop this one down to the floor. Once we leave this line, we move from the ambulatory, the apse, into the nave proper, the choir space here that we see in plan, to the transept of the nave. So this is the long 4-story space. This is like a 1-story height. And all this part is really there to structure the body of that church there. And then to give this kind of a rhythm to it, that one eventually would come down if we dotted it behind this column. Then this one comes down to meet it. So here's the edge of an open space behind our 2 columns. Now, just to show how this is going to grow now, we've gone from the base of the church to the spring point of the columns, which take the pinnacle of the arch for that first tier. And that's the whole apse, the whole choir here. Then it's got a little bit of a mural quality to it, so a wall of stone. And then it lights up again. And up here in the clerestory area is all stained glass and natural light coming in. And that comes for every section as you make your way around the church. And then we'd be on top of our plan over here if we kept sketching. So we'll drop down now, because right now we're on the inside skin of the ambulatory, and now we draw the arches that are behind it. And so down here, next to our column, we've got another arch that's going to let light in the first floor level. On this side, an arch will drop down there, and we'll separate these out in terms of what's letting in light and which are more structural. Behind this opening, we've got part of the vaulting coming down to a support column. So there's columns behind the front tier of columns. And so the idea that I mentioned a couple of times now that being a forest is really actualized in terms of all the structure coming down. And in the foreground, we'll just kind of lightly put this in because it's more about the space itself. But now we have the purpose of the space and the actual altar now, which is inside the choir, which is more rectilinear. It's probably more contemporary from the century. Sometimes churches keep the old artifacts. Sometimes they modernize and upgrade for the current realm of the Mass. In this case, there's some growth of sculpture and decorative elements on top of the altar. That's in the foreground there. So this is a lot, but you can see how just because we're talking about the same height columns throughout, by drawing them at different scales on this flat piece of paper, we actually created some idea of depth within this. And so we won't do justice to it in a half-hour sketch, and we won't be able to articulate all the presence of what the light means. But the day you visit that, we're going to go in the morning to visit properly, because when the sun comes through, it's unbelievable the structural technique that was at the dawn of this change in the scale of architecture on the face of the Western culture. So what's going to help us out here is we're going to go back and wash where the light doesn't meet. So that'll be in the shade areas to it. And typically what happens is that's all in the vault areas, because the light comes in and comes down and then bounces back up. So the darkest spots are really up here in the vault. So we can go ahead and kind of shade those out by taking the side of the pencil and just making those tops a little bit darker. And then in particular, when the vaults are next to the bright of the light, those will seem even darker yet. So we'll start with a tone next to that and drop that down here up on the vaults there, coming down in pieces. And then in this case, we've got the columns remaining, and we're going to work on those a little bit. What we don't want to do, because this is a plane in space, so you really can go from one side to the other and kind of cloak the whole thing because it's a flat surface. If we did that here, we would lose the roundness of it because it would become flat. So what we want to do is pick one side of it, just as a start, and say that's the side it's not going to receive light, because in this case, there is no natural light coming from the right, but there would be light coming from the nave back into the church this way. So we'll do the same over here and say this side is darker, and this side is darker. In this case, this side is darker too. And so we're going to use our ability to deal with value in terms of a range of tones, because we've got paper white, so that's 0% tone. And we've got as dark as the lines are, which is 100% black. So a good sketch is kind of a commingling of lots of grays, then we hold on some key white areas. So where, again, going up into the vault, that would be darker at the top and then come down the side of the columns. And then next to our column here, that still is a vault. So that'll be necessary to kind of pull that against the white of our column here. And so the white we leave when we're done should look brighter than the white of the page, because it's next to darker tones to it. So that'll help us build this out. We'll come and kind of delineate. They all sit on feet of secondary pieces of stone which flare out for structural integrity there. And in this case, there are actually little bastions of blocks which support the base of the columns each time. Just a quick delineation of those. There's actually a series of tombs that are between the columns here, because over the years there have been, many kings and many members from the king's family and their wives. And so what you'll see when you come here to these columns, for instance, here, that's actually the esophagus, and on top of that are sculptures which depict the people in that era of death for them, so that they look in sort of a piece of rest. Some are a little more aggressive than others, but it also is interesting because there's so many hundreds of years of sculpture that they've kept here or restored here now, is that it's a great way of looking at the history of that type of art as well, being much more abstract and less three-dimensional in the beginning and very, very lifelike towards certain periods of art history. And so this is actually a block where there's sculptural figures on the top of some king and queen laid to rest side by side there. And they make their route here. So this case, it's very, very bright because that's glazing. This is light coming in from the outside. So we'll make that column a little bit darker. So wherever we leave white now, we're saying that's a light source. Okay. So what's different up here is this is a light source and this is being lit by the nave. So we're going to go a little bit lighter on that because that's a stone wall. It takes us up to the gallery level, which is the next level of light. And we'll take a look at that at the next cathedral sketches we do. Because not only is there a system and plan, there's a system of interior elevation, which depicts how the church or the cathedral is used in terms of where people are allowed inside of it. So we'll come in one more pass here, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the final language impact that Saint-Denis has on the culture we're going to see as we keep sketching and future ideas here. So to help give this a little more solidity to it, we're going to realize that in a sketch that you never want to cloak everything the same because light moves around. So for instance, in this vault, the face of this is darker at the base and it becomes brighter at the top as light bounces around. There's an interstitial arch that comes in here and springs down. And so this one is trapped in there. And so that arch will actually be darker too. As we move back, this has got a series of ribs that come down that show up in our plan type here that spring in multiple directions. So those ribs, as they come and connect, it comes a little bit darker in the structure there. And now if we make that a little bit more clear, that dark here at the edge of that, we'll make that edge brighter next to it. So it's nice now to move some of the darks into the sketch proper so that we can take this piece and the edge of that and deepen that so that the wall outside and the nave itself gets brighter. Up top here, some of the secondary arches that are making the space, keynote off. We can go darker at the top and splay away. And then again, to make the columns a bit more round, we did one wash, and that wash was kind of flat. If you come back in now on half of that wash and just do the right of the right side, you start to build up more of a movement of the grays across that skin. And these will receive less light because they're outside the nave proper, sides of those. And then to kind of set these columns down, because back here, when you're actually in the ends, back parts, the light is coming in from the east. When you're in the part we are, as you approach the apse, more light's coming from the top light of the church back into it. So we can actually pitch now, coming from here, a bit of a floor line of cast shadows. And these can be kind of random because we're not doing a rendering here. We're just kind of doing some type of idea of striking through this so it flattens out the floor plane a bit. And they just kind of run through. And it's kind of just the hints at the idea that that used to be kind of a white volume that from here to here was all the same tone. By putting in those streaks of dark, as you go further back in perspective, this is really the same distance as that white, same as that, it's just that it's foreshortened in the drawing. So this is actually glazing. This is our closest look at a glass straight on. So right by that glazing, the arches that support that, there's the outside skin, detail for it. Those arches will be dark right at the top. And so we want to go really dark right where that window starts. And probably that's one of the darkest things we want to do because that really amplifies that's now a source of light for the drawing and not just something we look out through. We could probably gray this out and have that gray come down right next to that glazing to our base. There's a break line there where the glass stops, so we can go dark there as well. And now it's a matter of the last little bit is to think about the lines that started this, because on the edge of space, that's where you have the most movement of 3 dimensions. So we're going to come back to our original first block of columns here and make sure the edge of our component is a really dark line, because that changes the planes of space here. So we'll make that, because what's behind it now is actually volume. So if you can sense your eyes going around this and it's holding space behind it, that's a darker line. As opposed to this line is lighter because we want the line there, but it's not holding space around it. So it's a secondary type of line weight. So the ones here need to be a little bit stronger, and that helps pull the body of that off, particularly the ones that are in the foreground here. So we can do a little bit there on this one as well. Give a tone at the top of that one. And then certainly between here and the ambulatory, the choir on the inside, we want to drive a difference between that space. So those edges can be stronger. This one in the foreground for us is probably one of the strongest lines in the sketch because it sets it up. We want the darkest darks in contrast closest to us. As we move away, the definition can be a little more less definitive. So another thickness for this arch coming down, and you'll see as you come to photographs of this that there's more you can add to this and kind of finish it up, but we have a limited amount of time per sketch here. Give a tone for the altar now against that light. And at the top, we'll show that that's a real strong movement outside, and we'll make the stonework a little bit darker so that window becomes bright, because that's definitively really strong eastern light coming in from that window above the choir. There's an edge. So it's a monumental space in architectural history in terms of the start of this epic part of Western culture moving into incredibly high interior volumes that even to all of us that go to large spaces all the time, assembly halls and convention centers and athletic venues and whatever it is, we see a lot of volume all the time. This is such an impressive aspect of just working with trial and error of stone on site and have such vertical prominence that it's awe-inspiring, each and every church. And so we'll start with that process of moving through the scales of these, because after Notre Dame, we'll take the trip out to Chartres Cathedral, and then maybe you'll do a day trip to, or an overnight stay at Amiens or Beauvais or Reims Cathedral, which are sort of in the Ile-de-France area in the province there, not in the city center. Or for those who go to England, if you get to Salisbury Cathedral, that's the tallest one there outside of London in the west. So our little vignette here then is again of not the entire church being a spectacle of Gothic. It's just the construction of the apse by Abbot Suger and his primary architects at the time, the masons at the time, that forged a new future for the growth of construction of ecclesiastical architecture. So we can title this then the lower left if we like. Saint Denis, with segments of early Gothic, sort of slash Romanesque. To part two of definitively early Gothic, kind of the start of the language there. To later on, the rayonnette nave. So Saint Denis is, to this day, like I mentioned, the walk in the story is a 9-kilometer walk, is a bona fide small town by itself outside the city of Paris. It's connected by your metro paths to get out there. So we'll go as a group and visit the space. It will be, it's also the center for soccer for the team that plays out there. The great stadium for French pitch work is out in Saint Denis. You'll pass by that on the train ride out. It's got a lovely village for lunch and other kind of aspects of small churches there. And our restoration architect for this, like at Notre Dame, was Viollet-le-Duc from the 19th century. So this is now our springboard into the next stage of the high elements of Gothic design, where the Ile-de-France is entering into the heart of its Gothic era. And we'll pick up there on the next lecture.
Thank you.